Welcome, everyone, to Live Stronger Longer, a webinar in the Live Better Longer series that is put on by AFAR and Prevention. I am Sarah Smith. I am the editor-in-chief of Prevention, which is a health and wellness magazine that's been around for almost 75 years, and we are always interested in what the latest and greatest research is. I am really excited to partner with AFAR on this Live Better Longer series because I get to talk to some really fascinating and interesting experts in the field of health and aging. Of course, I want to remind everyone that the things we talk about today are educational, and if anything inspires you for your life, you should definitely talk to your doctor before you take on anything new. AFAR is a leader in health research and aging research, and Prevention is so fortunate to partner with them on this series. And as I said, Prevention has a long-standing history of curiosity around new research. So today I am here with Kevin Murach, who is an AFAR grantee and an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas. So Kevin, welcome. I'm so happy to be here with you today. But I'm hoping you can start actually by giving us a little background in what got you into this field at all. What interests you in it? I understand you played sports in school. Is that part of what got you into this?
Yeah, that was definitely kind of the entry point for me. Was when I was growing up, I call myself an athlete, although I think that's probably doing a disservice to athletes. I wasn't very good. I played, soccer and tennis in high school and didn't really proceed much further than that. But I got into like weightlifting and some endurance type of sports, from high school, college onwards. And I just enjoyed being healthy and lifting weights and riding my bike and things of that nature. And so what kind of started as sort of a personal interest in health and specifically in how my muscles were adapting to exercise kind of became my academic interest and focus as well over time. And so I was studying skeletal muscle and more or less in the context of exercise adaptation for long periods of time. And I still do that. That's still very much the focus of what I'm interested in. But the interest in aging, I guess, kind of maybe coincided with me getting a little older. I think that often happens with people getting into aging research. They are like, ooh, my body isn't responding the same way. What's going on here? And so I started kind of taking a personal interest in that as well. But I also, as I was transitioning to independence as a researcher and starting my own lab and these different things, I gave some thought to what type of research program would be, satisfying professionally and personally, and what type of things do I want to focus on with my skills and my expertise and my gifts. And I think aging made sense because it affects everybody, and it's the number one leading risk factor for a variety of chronic health conditions. It's the number one risk factor for developing cancer, and I mean nobody beats it. And so my thought was that if I wanted to influence the greatest number of people with my research, I could study aging because it's going to affect everybody. And so I started going down that path in the hopes of maybe not, making people immortal or anything. That's not really my goal, but for increasing people's quality of life and what we call health spans, the number of years in their lives that are spent healthy and not bedridden or relying on other people. And so that was sort of the impetus for me getting into the aging component. But exercise and skeletal muscle adaptation and health has always been kind of an overarching theme of my research program.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that background. It's really helpful to hear, your personal connection to it. And of course, your and mine, everyone's personal connection to aging only grows every day, as you point out.
Right.
Before we get into the real subject of today's talk, I do have to ask you another thing, because I learned when I was reading a little bit about your research that you worked on a project on the best exercise for astronauts, and I'm just going to bring that up, even though it's not our main topic, because astronauts are really cool, and I just want to know what you learned in that and how that plays into what you're doing now, just so we can transition.
Yeah. So this was during my my doctoral work. So I got my PhD in the Human Performance Laboratory at Ball State, which is in Muncie, Indiana, and it's the longest running human performance laboratory that's still open in America. And there was a relationship that was established by Dr. Dave Costel, who's like a legendary exercise physiologist and muscle biologist in our field. And he established this relationship with NASA that continued on after he retired by my mentor, who was still at Ball State. And the project was related to the idea that when you go to space, there's no gravity, and you maintain muscle mass on Earth just by virtue of being on Earth and there being gravity and you having to kind of support your body with your muscles. So that can help to maintain muscle mass. When you go to space, that goes away. And that's a big problem for astronauts, because, you know, they have to do different tasks in space that requires, you know, muscle strength and power and muscle function to be working correctly. And also, if you go to a new location, the moon, Mars, wherever, when you get there, you're going to have to do things, and the gravity is lower, and so you need to, you know, still be effective. And we think that probably the best way to maintain your muscle mass and function, really, in many aspects, which you know, on Earth and in outer space, which is probably something we're going to touch on later, is via exercise. And so the project was a continuation of a long running project that's at NASA, but also in space agencies all around the world are interested in the same question of how do we maintain muscle mass and function when you go into microgravity, because if you don't do anything, you'll just kind of waste away. And so the project was an Earth-based study where people laid in bed for long periods of time, because that kind of can simulate space flight and the muscle deadaptation that happens during long-term space flight. So it was a long-term bed rest study where people got muscle samples before and after bed rest, or they gave muscle samples to us using a biopsy technique. And then they some of them underwent different exercise protocols to try and figure out what the best exercise prescription could be for maintaining muscle mass loss during long periods of muscle inactivity. And so that was my dissertation. And it was a really interesting project. And we found that doing this combination of resistance training with high intensity interval and aerobic type exercise was a pretty potent combination for maintaining muscle mass, and that it was beneficial. And those results, you know, yes, it was geared towards astronauts, but it really does kind of apply to really any situation where you have a reduced activity level, because if you aren't very active, especially as you're aging, you tend to lose muscle mass. And so it could apply to that situation as well as other situations where people are bedridden for long periods of times if they're ill. What we learned about exercise and the type of exercise could translate to that. So I felt like it was a good project, and we learned a lot. And yeah, it's very interesting that you know, astronauts were kind of involved tangentially, I suppose, but people do get muscle samples from astronauts before and after they go to space and look at how effective the exercise is and stuff. And that's a whole other area of research that people are working on actively. So it's very interesting stuff.
That's very interesting. And I thank you for explaining also how it connects to, you know, people on Earth here, you know, as you know, maybe have reason to be sedentary. But I do also like to think of the idea of our grandchildren going to live on Mars and work that you did helping them.
Sure. Yeah, that's the hope.
Okay, so let's talk. Let's give our listeners so a little background on a few important elements of your work, and then we'll dive a little more deeper into it. Okay, so can you tell us a little bit about how muscles naturally decline with age and what we know and don't know about that process?
Sure. So as we get older, our muscle mass tends to decline gradually, and this is, you know, a natural process that seems to happen to everyone. And that's probably the most overt and obvious kind of manifestation of what we see with aging with respect to at least like skeletal muscle, like your leg muscles and your arm muscles and the things used to get around, lift things. They tend to get smaller as you get older. And there's also a tendency for your muscle to get weaker and also produce less power, which is the product of force and velocity. So it's kind of an integrated measure. Power production is very, very important for overall muscle function, just overall whole body function. All these things tend to decline as you age. And there's probably a variety of reasons for why that happens. As you get older, there's things that happen within the muscle cellularly that tend to change, that aren't always favorable for muscle mass and function. Maybe the muscle gets a little more fatty in it, so kind of more marbled in some ways, like a fatty steak, so to say. And obviously, it's that fat is not contractile, so it's not contributing to overall force production and function. So things like that can happen. The nerves that are innervating the muscle can tend to sort of die off, and so the muscle cells are being activated by those nerves can no longer fire. So you don't have as much function in those muscle cells, and so maybe you tend to lose them. There's a lot of other things that happen systemically too that can contribute to this muscle dysfunction that happens with age. You kind of have a higher level of inflammation as you get older. And there's a lot of really interesting things that happen in the muscle fiber and in the cell itself and around the muscle fibers or cells that could be contributing to these maladaptive responses as we get older. So really it's, loss of muscle mass, loss of overall function. And eventually, if you lose enough mass, lose enough of that function, it can lead to a loss of independence because you can't kind of do things on your own anymore. And you have to rely on other people, or, maybe have to have someone around to help you all the time. And so, and that's not ideal either. So maintaining muscle mass and function is really important to try and kind of avoid that loss of independence that can happen in the later years of life.
Yeah, super crucial. I mean, what's more important? Okay, so tell us now what happens when we exercise a muscle. What's happening physiologically, and also what do we even mean when we say exercise? Are we talking about just walking? Are we talking about strength training? Are we talking about both?
Yeah, I mean, I think exercise, I can consider it to be continuous or like intermittent activity above the levels of normal exertion, kind of for the purposes of improving health. So that could be intentional. That could be like going for a run, going for a walk, a bike, lifting weights, going to the gym. These things are planned and intentional. Or, it could be more unstructured in that. Maybe you have a pretty physically demanding job and you have to lift a lot of things all day long. And that could also be a form of exercise. And so, yeah, I mean, but I think, exercise can take a lot of different forms, but I think it's important to focus on cardiovascular health as well as skeletal musculoskeletal health. So making your muscles and your bones stronger too by loading, so like resistance training. So combination of those two things I think are really, really important. But it's for maintaining health throughout the lifespan, but also for performance and athletes and astronauts and everybody. So, but yeah, so what happens to the muscle when you exercise? Well, a lot of things happen. Usually exercise is a systemic response. So a lot of things are happening in a lot of different organ systems, but in the skeletal muscle specifically, essentially what happens is those muscle cells, muscle fibers, what we call them, they're kind of these like long cylinders. They're very much different in structure and function than most other cells in the body. They have lots of nuclei that have the DNA in them, whereas most cells only have one nucleus with DNA in it. And so it's a very unique structure, but they get, bigger and smaller, they contract, and that's how you get from A to B and how you lift things and like that. But when you contract the muscle rhythmically or against weight, a cascade of events happens where you have the DNA in the nuclei of the muscle cell essentially gets activated, and then genes become active or repressed based on the stimulus. And then what happens is those genes express and they get turned into messenger RNAs, which are kind of like the little templates for the proteins that ultimately get made, which then lead to adaptation. As the proteins being made in the muscle in response to exercise is ultimately what leads to adaptation. And so you kind of have this cascade of events starting at the DNA that ultimately results in protein being made that is specific to whatever the stimulus was that you're putting on. So let's say if you're resistance training, the proteins that would be made would be, a lot of the contractile proteins that would make the muscle stronger. So that the next time you go to lift weights, you have a little more of that contractile protein there. So you were able to lift a little extra weight perhaps. And so, yeah, that happens over a longer period of time. And so, you have to do that repeatedly over and over again to get those adaptations. But that's kind of like the general scheme of what happens when you go to exercise your muscles.
That's great. It's really helpful and interesting to hear it put that way, you know, that all these things are happening inside that you're.
Yep.
Yep, love it. Okay, so one more background type question. If could you speak to epigenetics? Because I believe that's important to your work, and I think we should make sure everyone's on the same page with what that means, especially in this context.
Sure. I think for the purposes of the conversation today, we could define epigenetics as changes in gene expression that are not caused by changes in the genetic code. So within your muscle cell, it's, maybe your quad muscle, or, your vastus lateralis, which is a big muscle of your quadriceps, one of those big muscles, may have thousands and thousands of muscle cells, which are these long, kind of spaghetti looking things. And inside, and those are the contractile units, so they shorten and lengthen with contraction and relaxation. It's how you move your limbs around, is by the contraction of these muscle cells. And so you have these long cylindrical cells, in those, each one of those long cylindrical muscle fibers or muscle cells are all these nuclei, which have all the DNA. So they're like the control centers of the muscle fibers. And so within that DNA, within those nuclei is the DNA, and that DNA is not just, packed in there willy-nilly. It's organized in a very intricate and sophisticated way to control gene expression. So to control which genes get expressed at different times. This is how your muscle or really all the cells in your body maintain homeostasis, is by the expression of these genes at different times for different purposes. So when you stress the muscle, for instance, a certain set of genes gets upregulated while other ones get downregulated. And the control of that expression of genes is largely mediated by epigenetics. So it's how the genes get accessed. So there's a lot of different ways in which the genes can be accessed, or how that control of the access to the genes occurs. So, the DNA is organized in a very specific kind of like origami way, and it kind of needs to be unpacked in order for what's called transcription factors, which are these really important proteins, to come in and bind on the DNA and then express the genes that you want to express at a given time. Or if you want to repress certain genes at a given time, it can do that too. And so there's these different epigenetic marks that can be placed onto the DNA at different places to either cause or facilitate a gene to be turned on and expressed at a certain time, or turned off at a certain time. And so that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about epigenetics, is those different marks that then go and bind to the DNA, or sit on the DNA in different places to facilitate the expression or repression of genes at different times. So in response to exercise, so if you go and did a resistance exercise out at the gym, for instance. I usually think about things in the context of resistance exercises. I like it. And so you go to the gym, you lift a weight. There may be some changes in some of these epigenetic marks that allow the transcription factors, these really important proteins, to come in and access the DNA and express the genes you want to express, so that you can then adapt, make these proteins. The muscle can maybe get bigger or stronger, so that you can continue to lift more weights and not cause damage to yourself. And so these epigenetics is kind of almost like this first layer of control of that response, of that, cascade layered response that leads to the adaptation you're ultimately hoping for in your muscle cells. So I guess that's
the genetic marker that we could theoretically have control over by doing exercises. It's not just something that happens in a lab.
No, yeah. Every time you go exercise, these things can be changed on your DNA. Yeah.
Right.
Specifically, like I said, that can come in a lot of flavors. There's a lot of different ways in which the access to the DNA can be controlled. And we don't need to go into all of those, but the one I focus on mostly is your DNA is composed of these nucleic acids, A, C's, T's, and G's, and those C's can get a little methyl group put onto them that can then control whether the gene that is near it gets expressed or not expressed. And so that's kind of what I focus on. And yeah, when we go exercise, the methylation is what we call these little methyl groups get stuck onto these C's, can either get taken away or added on to the DNA, and that would express whether or not the genes that are near it would get expressed. And this happens, it's a very dynamic process. I mean, epigenetic marks through through generations can also maintain too. But that's sort of epigenetic inheritance, which is a different thing. When we're talking about the context of somatic cells, like skeletal muscle and exercise, these things can tend to change pretty quickly in response to exercise. But what's also interesting though, is that these epigenetic marks, if you exercise for a while, can like kind of have a memory, we think, like they can kind of serve as a memory within the muscle cell of things you had done previously. So maybe if you had exercised your whole life and then you stopped exercising for a period of time and back to exercising, some of these methylation marks might be a little more permanent and can help facilitate you adapting more quicker when you get back to exercising again. So this idea of like epigenetic muscle memory, and we've studied that a little bit too. But yeah, these changes in epigenetics can happen pretty transiently in response to an exercise bout, and is contributing to this overall adaptive response, which you want to have when you exercise in your skeletal muscles. So.
Right. Thank you. Fascinating. Okay, so going deeper, tell us what MYC is. Is this what you were just talking about?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, and so what is it and why are you studying it?
Yeah, it's a good segue. So MYC or MYC, what we sometimes call it is one of these transcription factors that I was talking about. So it's this protein that's found in your cells, and in response to stress, such as exercise, it can go and attach to DNA and cause the expression of hundreds, even thousands of different genes in response to different things like exercise, for instance. So MYC is one of these transcription factors that goes and interacts with the DNA, and it has an important role in making sure that the adaptive response occurs. And so, yeah, I study it mostly. Well, what kind of got me onto this specific transcription factor called MYC is the fact that it tends to go up in muscle with exercise. It goes up quite a bit, like very significantly, and it goes up specifically in the muscle cells or the muscle fibers. But nobody really had a great sense for what it was doing. It seems like it could be really important. You know, we think that it can control this one protein. MYC can control up to 15% of all the genes that you have. So maybe you have 26,000 genes. MYC might control up to 15% of those, the expression of those in your cells, which is pretty incredible. And that was interesting to me, but it was also interesting that it was kind of understudied and that people didn't really have a great handle on why it was increasing with exercise, what it could be doing in the muscle. And we saw an opportunity there because we thought it was an important factor in that it may be, something that is really important for mediating the beneficial effects of exercise. And so we kind of got into it with that thinking, and has since evolved from that time. But yeah, MYC is definitely one of those things that we think could be really important for exercise adaptation. This is what we're trying to study and learn now. But it's also has, some other functions that sometimes aren't so great. If you turn it on in a cell for a long period of time, it can be oncogenic, so it could cause cancer. So that's not really a good thing. But the thing is, cancer is essentially a growth program, and MYC is central to that growth program. And so if we could control it, then maybe we could control muscle growth. So that was kind of the thinking. And so, but also MYC is one of 4 transcription factors called Yamanaka factors, which are really important for essentially making somatic cells, so like bodies from your cell, into like a pluripotent stem cell, which can then go on to become any other type of cell. So if you overexpressed these 4 factors, one of them is MYC, you could take a skin cell and turn it into a pluripotent stem cell, which could then go become a bone cell or an eye cell or whatever. And so it has this really powerful effect in combination with these other factors too. And that was interesting to us as well. So it's kind of a complicated thing where it's like, okay, it goes up with exercise, but then it comes back down in the muscle. So it clearly seems to have some important role, but if you express it too long, that wouldn't be a good thing. So trying to understand the temporal dynamics of how it gets turned on and off, but also what it's doing when it's on, could help give us some insight into exercise adaptation. Because when you exercise a young muscle, this MYC goes up for sure. And so we want to kind of learn more about this transcription factor, how it's interacting with DNA, how it's controlling the genes in the muscle, and therefore how it's controlling adaptation. So that's kind of what has been interesting in my lab since we started it.
That's very interesting, because when you talk about it, eventually being able to maybe turn into another cell, and what, young muscles are doing? I mean, this is a real layperson question, but I mean, it almost seems like you're making your body younger from the inside
That's
with this.
that's sort of the hope.
Is it-
Yeah.
yeah.
No, I think you're on the right path. Yeah. I mean, that's sort of our thinking too. It's if we can turn it on in the right ways at the right time, maybe it could have this result of kind of making the muscle younger, since when you overexpress these Yamanaka factors, so to say, so this combination of 4 transcription factors, one of which is MYC, when you turn those on in a cell, it does essentially revert their age backwards epigenetically towards like a younger state. And it also makes that cell more adaptable to different things. And so, yeah, part of the thinking here is, okay, when we exercise, MYC turns on in the muscle. We know that it can have these beneficial effects in small doses. So is it having this effect where it can effectively make the muscle younger at the cellular and maybe epigenetic level through the beneficial effects of it? And so that is definitely part of our thought process and thinking here, as far as what it could be doing in the muscle cells. And maybe it could even, I don't know, maybe amplify the effects of exercise if you control it in the right way. So that's sort of our thought process. And maybe if you turn it on at the right times for the right amount of time, it could prevent muscle mass loss, or maybe it could promote the gain of muscle mass, which I think would have probably obvious benefits for aging as our muscles get smaller and weaker and less powerful. Maybe there's some of these factors, these transcription factors like MYC, that we could leverage and control to help make muscle healthier. So we're just starting to begin to unravel some of these roles of what it's doing and how it could be doing it, and whether this could be a beneficial sort of starting point for understanding how to improve muscle health throughout the lifespan.
Yeah, it sounds so promising and interesting, but also so fascinating that too much is not a good thing, that you can go too far. So threading that needle sounds super important. And so can you tell us like how you're studying it? You do trials with mice, right? So what are you having them do? And how then do you think about what that means for us?
Yeah, and there's a lot of ways that we go about studying. Well, the first thing is that I want to say up front that I think it's important that the things we study are based in human biology, right? We use mice, we use cells, we use all these model systems to try and understand what these factors are doing. But at the end of the day, we also want to know that it's something that's a natural response to exercise in humans. And so the first studies we did, a number of years ago, human beings were exercising, we take muscle samples from them, like using these needle biopsies. We take muscle samples before and after exercise, and then we look for these things, see, does MYC go up? Is it, responding the same way that we see with the exercise in the mice? And the answer is yes, it does go up in the humans, and it goes up a lot. And we think it's a very important thing for exercise adaptations in humans. So I just want to say that up front, we're not trying to be the best mouse biologists, you know what I mean? Like, we want to translate our results that we get in the lab to the human population, of course. So with that being said, we do use mice, we do use cells, we use all these model systems to try and replicate, things that we see in humans. So yeah, when we exercise mice, for instance, there's a lot of different ways to approach it, but a lot of times what we'll do is mice like to be active. They'll run on a wheel, on a young mouse will run on a wheel 10 to 12 kilometers a night. So think about that. Like, how many people do you know that run 10 to 12 kilometers a day, right? And so they're very active creatures, mice, and they tend to be active at night. They're nocturnal. And so, but yeah, they'll run a lot. And so what we do is we just put little weights on their wheels and, gradually add more weight over time, the same way you would with resistance training in human beings to get their muscles to grow and adapt. We do the same thing with the mice. We just leverage the fact that they enjoy being on the wheel, and we just put the weights on there. And over time, they get bigger, they get stronger, they kind of turn into athletes, their hearts get healthier, they're healthier mice. And so that's kind of what we do to exercise our mice, so we can understand some of these exercise responses in humans as well. And yes, when we exercise the mice, we see these similar responses in MYC in the muscle and all these things. So we know that it's a somewhat representative model of what we're seeing with exercise training in human beings. So that's one thing that we do to help us understand exercise adaptation in the skeletal muscle. And we do this in young and old mice too. And so we can draw comparisons and, see if maybe MYC doesn't respond as well in older muscle, which is true. It seems to be the case. And so we do those types of things, but we also have these genetically modified mice, which are these very, very special mice where we can control gene expression only in the muscle at will. So we can turn a gene on and turn a gene off at any time in the lifespan of the mouse, only in the muscle fibers. So this is kind of getting to the point I was making, that we're able to have this like kind of temporal control over gene of a specific gene that we're interested in, so that we can turn it on, but also turn it off so that it doesn't cause negative effects after being on for too long. And so yeah, it gives us this really exquisite control over the expression of this transcription factor, or MYC, that we're interested in. So we can turn it on and turn it off, and we can turn it on during exercise if we want to try and understand the interaction between it and exercise. And so there's a lot of different kind of experiments we can do with this ability, and it allows us to kind of get in there and see, okay, when we just manipulate this one thing, what are all the downstream effects? Are there things that are happening as a consequence of this that we can also leverage as, part of the exercise response, and maybe turn it into some sort of therapeutic or something along those lines? And so, but it really just gives us a very controlled understanding of what this one thing is doing in the muscle, and whether it can even perhaps in and of itself mimic aspects of exercise, which is something that we're actively pursuing. So yeah, those are the kind of the different tools that we use with our mice, at least, to try and understand muscle adaptation throughout the lifespan.
Great. So tell us about some interesting findings.
Yeah. So, when we use our MYC overexpression model, so when we turn this transcription factor on only in the muscle, so we take adult mice, which are about 4 months old, they tend to live to about 24 months. So the life, depending on where your animal facility is, a bunch of different factors. I mean, mice will live anywhere between 24 and 30 months, so a couple of years essentially. So we'll take the adult mice that are about 4 months old, and we'll turn MYC on just one time, just one brief pulse of MYC, kind of like a bout of exercise. So MYC would go on and then it would turn off in response to exercise. We can do that same thing just with the mouse. We turn the MYC on, turn it off in the muscle. And then we can go and do all these different molecular analyses to understand, okay, well, what did it do when we turned it on? Right. And so we can harvest these muscles, and then we can look at all these different things. We can look at what genes were being expressed in response to it. We can look at epigenetic changes. We can look at a whole variety of different things. And we find that even when we just turn on MYC one time, just one single pulse, like a single exercise bout, so to say, we see the changes in thousands of genes in the muscle, which is absolutely incredible. Like this one thing, turn it on for just a short period of time, and we see all these changes. And then when we overlap changes we see from that with the changes we see with exercise adaptation, we find that there is some overlap there. And it does seem like this transcription factor that is responsive to exercise is controlling some of the exercise response that we see. And so that was interesting to us. And then we also found that when we turn on this one transcription factor for a short period of time, it changes the epigenetic landscape of the DNA in the muscle. So we see these changes in epigenetics in response just to this one factor being turned on, which tells us that this one factor in some way has a role in controlling epigenetics as well, which is really fascinating. So we think it's kind of doing a lot of different things in the muscle. And so now we're doing some more longer term studies to try and understand what it's doing when we do this on a more repetitive basis. Is it like exercise? Do we see similar adaptations to exercise as we do to just turning on and turning MYC off for periods of time? So these are some of the questions we're interested in.
So when you say that it's creating these changes, are these positive changes? Is it mixed? Is that not how you think about it?
I just think of them as changes, because I don't at this point, because we know what's going on and off with exercise, right? And so we like to think that they're positive changes. But when we exercise, more than one thing is getting turned on, like MYC may be increasing, but other transcription factors may be also increasing, which are competing. And so we don't know, we're just turning on this one thing. It's not in concert with all the other things that change during exercise in the muscle, because a lot of things change in the muscle during exercise, and in response to exercise in order for you to ultimately adapt. And so, we think they're mostly good things, but yeah, I mean, it could be that some of them are not ideal. And so that's hopefully something what we'll learn more about as we kind of do more experiments and learn more about this transcription factor.
Yeah, tell me more about what you're hoping to learn in the near and far future in your lab.
Yeah, I mean, I think we want to see if we can use this transcription factor as a way to make the muscle appear younger. So we could do some of these, we're planning to do some of these experiments in older mice where we turn on MYC and turn it off and see if maybe when we do that enough times, would either the epigenetic landscape or the gene expression landscape or the whole muscle itself, will it take on a phenotype that's more similar to a younger mouse or take on a phenotype that's more similar to an exercised mouse? And so those are kind of the things we're understanding and we're trying to learn from using these models is like, can we just manipulate this one thing and get some of the benefits of exercise? Can we make the muscle more functional when it's old? Can we make it bigger? Can we make it more metabolically healthy? Like, is it going to do some of these things that we hope that exercise would do? We combine it with exercise too and see, oh, wow, it supercharged the exercise or made it worse. No, I guess hopefully we'll find out with time. But the hope is that, through this, we can learn some different things about how exercise responses are regulated, so that maybe it can be leveraged into, customized exercise prescriptions for people to maximize some of these responses, or perhaps even therapeutics for people that aren't able to exercise or have a less robust response to exercise than some other people. Try to, develop some therapeutics to help optimize the exercise response. So those are kind of things that we're hoping for here. And it, starts with our mouse models and our sort of preclinical studies to try and translate that up to humans. So it'll take time. But yeah, understanding some of these cellular and molecular mechanisms can give us insight into developing things that can help to improve our whole bodies throughout the lifespan.
Okay, right. That's interesting because that kind of answers like a question, like a big picture, like down the road, are we going to be able to turn back time on our muscles? And you're saying with more research, maybe it turns into therapeutics, maybe it turns into specific kinds of recommendations. Is that fair that at some point this might lead to that kind of?
Sure. I think that's definitely the hope. And I mean, I think we can say with some level of confidence at this point, though, that, we know exercise is good, right? And we know it's generally a beneficial thing for most people. We know that even as you get older, exercise has a ton of beneficial effects. And I think, data from our laboratory has shown that, like, even at the epigenetic level in our mice, we exercise them late in their life. So start from 22 months and go to 24 months, which is about the end of their lifespan. And then we look at their muscles. There's a lot of different epigenetic marks in the muscle that are being kind of pushed back towards a younger state. And so, and that's just, a relatively short amount of exercise towards the end of life makes the muscle stronger and healthier metabolically, but also has these really interesting epigenetic effects. So we wonder if those epigenetic effects of exercise, A, are they being mediated by MYC? And B, are they underpinning the beneficial effects of exercise in general? And then can we understand how to increase it so that exercise becomes more effective as you're older? Or, maybe, can do certain things to prevent muscle mass loss if you do it, a little bit throughout the lifespan. So these are things that we're sort of thinking about.
That's interesting. And it sounds like from what you're saying with these 22-month-old mice that it's not too late to get the benefits or the changes if you exercise, because it's happening.
In mice or humans, certainly. Yes. Yeah, it's never too late to start. I mean, our old mice, starting 22 months, going to 24, we see a ton of benefits in their muscle. I mean, the exercise response in those mice isn't quite the same as the young ones. It's not quite as substantial, but there's still a lot of benefits there. The muscles get bigger, the muscles get stronger. We see all these molecular changes that are pretty similar to what we see in our younger mice. But importantly, in human beings, yes, like even very older individuals that maybe hadn't even exercised much throughout their lifespan, if they take up an exercise regime even later in their lives, they can realize benefits. You can get stronger, you can increase your muscle function and your power. You can even get muscle growth, depending on the exercise prescription. And so, yeah, I mean, there's benefits, I think, to exercising throughout the lifespan. But I don't think it's too late to start. Obviously you need to consult with your medical doctor and make sure that, you're healthy enough to even begin an exercise program. But if you are, there's so many benefits that can be realized even later in life. And so I think that's a very important message.
That's great. And it's a good reminder to talk to your doctor about what would work for you, because we're not going to be on the mouse wheels, but
Right. You're not going to be running 10 to 12 kilometers a night for sure. I mean, older mice run less. 22-month-old mice will maybe run more like 6 to 8 kilometers a night, 4 kilometers. So it's less, but still a lot, but yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. Like as you get older, you're probably not going to be, running marathons and doing triathlons as you were when you were younger, but you can still get a lot of benefit from a little bit of exercise. I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind.
that's a great message. This is really fascinating, Kevin, and we have some interesting questions coming in too from our audience. So I'm going to turn to some of those.
Sure.
So someone says, so you mentioned inflammation earlier, and in muscles or joints, do you see this happening in one area than another? And yeah, I've heard the term inflammaging. Is that what's happening here? How would you connect that to this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it seems like as you get older, your baseline inflammation throughout your body increases. So it would be something that could be detected in the blood. There's these cells that sometimes people call zombie cells, which I think have become kind of a popular way to think about them in the media. They're called senescent cells, really, as when we study them as scientists. But they tend to accumulate throughout your body as you get older, and they basically secrete all of these different inflammatory compounds that can go and affect all the different things, your heart, your muscle, all your organs, really. So it's almost as if your body is sort of being bathed a little bit in more of like an inflammatory bath as you get older. And fortunately, exercise acutely can cause a little bit of an inflammatory response in the muscle, but over time it can reduce the systemic inflammation that we see. And but it does seem to be happening everywhere, and it could be a consequence of a variety of things. One of those things maybe being these like senescent or zombie-like cells that spit out these inflammatory compounds. But yeah, it does seem to happen everywhere, but exercise chronically can help to reduce that inflammation and improve muscle health, but really just whole body health as well.
That's great, because that immediate short-term helpful inflammation is so interesting compared to that long-term problematic. So I
Sure.
love the exercise. It gives you the good stuff and helps you with the bad kind.
Exactly. And it's important to make that distinction too, because an acute bout of exercise can be cause a little bit of inflammation for sure, but over time it will tamp down that chronic inflammation. Yeah.
Um, so we often think of cognition, the brain, when we think about memory, but you mentioned muscle memory.
Mhm.
So can
Sure.
you talk more about how that works and
Yeah.
how it changes as we age?
It's probably muscle. We use the term muscle memory, and a lot of times people think of that more as like riding a bike, right? Like that's muscle memory. If you haven't ridden a bike in 20 years, but you get back on the bike, you remember how to do it. You don't like fall off like you did the first time. At least hopefully you don't. And so, but that seems to be more like a neuromuscular kind of patterning sort of thing. So that's sort of like more in your brain and your CNS. And so it has more to do with that. When I say muscle memory in the context of like cellular muscle memory, like with exercise, I'm talking about what's happening in the muscle cells. And really what I'm talking about is what's happening like epigenetically in the nuclei of the muscle cells. So basically, like if you exercise chronically, some epigenetic changes will occur in the muscle. And, once you stop exercising, some of those changes might remain. So that the next time that exercise can be considered a stressor. So when your body next time encounters that stress of exercise, it's able to adapt more quickly because the genes are sort of primed to respond because of the epigenetics that changed much earlier on when you were exercising more consistently. And so that's kind of what we say when we think about epigenetic memory. It's like the DNA sort of remembers what was happening with exercise prior and sort of keep some things around in order to, just in case you start exercising again, you have to face that stress again. It can basically ramp up more quickly and get you back to where you were in a more rapid fashion. And that's something we've done some studies with, and it's been shown in humans that this can be the case. We've done some mouse studies showing that this could be the case as well. So it's definitely an open area of inquiry and something that my lab is interested in.
That's interesting. And it's so reassuring too, for anyone who's taken time off, and even if you're not a former athlete, like you, or, that we all, most of us were more active as kids and teenagers, and right.
Fortunately, yes. Yeah, for sure.
They're still in there, the stuff that you did, the skipping down the block, which by the way, skipping is so much harder than you remember.
I agree. I can't say the last time I've skipped or frolicked.
I
It's been a
know, I was
while.
with a kid and I was like, oh my God, this is so hard. But it's in there. It's in there if you work it. Okay, we have a question about whether there's a risk in excessive exercise,
Sure.
particularly as we age for older. Can you exercise? Is there, it's too much? It's too much.
Sure. My mind goes to two places. I think there is one risk where it's like, okay, again, I'm not a medical doctor, so I'm not prescribing exercise here. But if you had not done exercise in a very long period of time, then just decided up one day, I'm just going to go run 10 miles. Yeah, there's probably risk associated with that. Your body isn't ready for that stress. And so that's one thing. That, going from nothing to something or even a lot could surely lead to injury. And there's such a thing as overuse injuries too. And so, if you do something a lot chronically, that can lead to, without taking appropriate rest and treating your body the way it's supposed to be treated during recovery, can lead to these chronic overuse injuries. I think the threshold for causing damage from too much exercise is probably relatively high. But the thing is, as you get older, your recovery doesn't always go the same as it was when you're a little bit younger. So I think if you're going to exercise more than, prescribe more than what a normal person would do, and if you have the capability of doing that, making sure that you budget for some extra recovery as you get a little older too is important, because it's recovery is when the adaptation happens. It's when you're resting, when you're sleeping. The exercise is the stimulus, but it's everything that happens after. Those genes get turned on after exercise, say a resistance exercise bout, over the course of 24 to 48 hours, different genes are turning on at different times. And that's when all that adaptation is occurring, when you're nourishing yourself, when you're eating, when you're resting. And as you get older, some of these processes are just slowed down. And so not to say they can't happen, they're just happening a little bit of a slower rate. That recovery time, and treat your body well in the interim too, because the exercise is important, but the recovery is also very important.
That's such a good reminder to respect that recovery time and to not think I have to push it if I want to get to where I used to be. You can't unless you let yourself body recover.
Yeah, you have to be really, really smart about it. And I mean, I'm learning that lesson now as I'm getting on in years, and my body doesn't recover quite the same way it used to. Maybe I can still lift that heavy weight, but then I'm paying the price for, a couple extra days. And so I have to budget for that. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just hearing some bike racers that I know talk about that the other day. They were in the 50+ bike race and they said, oh boy, I have to do more recovery. So I can't wait to tell them next week. Yeah, do it. Okay, so let's I think we'll take one more and wrap it up. And we have a question about resistance training and muscle strength. So this person was wondering specifically about rebounding, if you have thoughts on that, kind of the jumping on the little mini trampoline things.
Oh, I don't have any thoughts on that.
Okay,
Actually, I haven't
fine.
really thought much about about trampoline exercise. I would say if you're going to do it, be really careful, because maybe maybe those fast twitch fibers don't fire as much as they used to. So if you fall off, you might run into a problem. So I would say be careful if you do it. But no, I haven't thought too much about ballistic work with. I probably, if I were to prescribe exercise for especially an older person, I probably wouldn't go with ballistic exercise first. I'd probably go with something a little more conservative. Yeah.
Right.
But
So
anyway.
so the resistance training, though, you think I mean, again, we're talking to our doctor, we're seeing, what's right for us, but that is really a place where that and cardiovascular is really where you're seeing safe.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's really important to not neglect the resistance training, in my view. I think, it gets harder as I've stated before, to build muscle mass as you get older. You lose some of it as you get older. And, endurance exercise is wonderful for your heart, and it does have great effects on your skeletal muscles as well. It can keep them metabolically healthy. But if you want to be strong and have power production, which is really important as you age, resistance training can be important for that. And I think that it's something that should not be neglected. I mean, I wouldn't jump into just lifting heavy weights or doing anything like that. I mean, you can start with body weight exercises and things like that. Things that are kind of low impact, not ballistic, but that can help to build up your strength, and then you can start adding a little bit of weight. And this can help to, help you to put on muscle mass, help you to gain back some of that function that you're naturally losing over time. Because yeah, I mean, that once you get to a certain point, it can get hard to put on muscle mass. So the more that you have getting into your older years, I think it can be beneficial. And resistance training is kind of the key core component of that. So I would say definitely don't neglect that. But obviously aerobic training, massively important, so important for your heart. And certain kinds of it can help you maintain muscle mass, like cycling, pushing against loads can help to preserve muscle mass. And so there's a lot of things that can be done. Ideally, a combination of those two. I mean, that's how I train predominantly. 3 days a week of lifting, and that's what I do. 3 days a week of lifting, and then the rest is some sort of cardiovascular, maybe riding my bike or rowing or something to that effect. So that's what I enjoy to do. And I think the big thing though is finding something that you enjoy and that you're going to stick with, because that's the hardest challenge is being consistent. If you can be consistent, that's most of the battle right there. And so finding something that you really enjoy is really important. And so, because then you're more likely to stick with it, regardless of what it is. And so I think, trying some different things, seeing what you like, and then staying with it, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, that's a great message too, to, force yourself to do something you hate, to look for something that really works for you, because we're not working on getting the gene that the mice have for loving to be on the wheel for hours.
Right. And a lot of that's happening up here. People do research that. They've bred mice and rats to be high runners versus low runners, and there's certain genes that are associated with the levels of activity. So that's a whole area. It's not something I'm sorry terribly, but yeah.
I mean, I do think, good for the mice for that commitment, but we have very complex thoughts and lives, and we can't live like mice. So I think, trying new things and varying it up sounds very human.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, Kevin, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much for all of your insight today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun. Hopefully we can do this again sometime. Maybe in a couple of years, if we do some more studies, I'll have some better answers.
Definitely would love to hear the update when you've got some new studies. So thank you all. So thanks mostly to Kevin, of course, for his incredible knowledge that he shared today. But we couldn't do it without our audience. So thank you all so much for being here. And we hope that you'll follow Prevention and AFAR wherever you get your social media, so that you can see what's coming up next with the Live Better Longer series in the future. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kevin, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Take care. Thank you.